Does your interview team have expertise in racial equity? Do they understand the importance of a diverse workforce? Has that been established across the board? This sort of goes back to what we were talking about before. When you have not had a discussion about what the expectations are, then we are so much more likely, this is where in-group bias comes out again too, is to really sort of, people end up paying attention more to the kinds of resumes or applications that have the kinds of bells and whistles. But really, what are we talking about what will set someone up to be able to do the job that we're asking? I already talked about this, so you have the opportunity to actually do some prep with your interview committee. Decide together, talk about the ways that biases can show up. Decide ahead of time how you're going to talk about it. Decide ahead of time that the interview panel is going to be open to hearing from someone else if they think that bias is showing up, instead of becoming defensive about it, because that's something that is very easy to do. Vetting interview questions, this is again where focus groups could potentially come into play. But really thinking about the ways that biases might be embedded in the questions that you have on the hiring committee. And then advice on how issues that are tied to the organization's culture should be handled. Related to the questions then, you want to stick to questions that are more about behaviors. So really taking the time to say, instead of saying, are you a good negotiator? Tell me about a time that you had to negotiate and tell me about how it went. Give a real example, probe for details. Allow for someone to really sort of talk about those skills. Otherwise, you're sort of like left sort of picking among people who are more likely to be able to sell themselves better, who are less likely to have a certain sense of anxiety in that room, because again, there are ways that there are some folks with specific identities that for whom this process is that much more anxiety producing. And so how do you set people up to be able to really sort of speak about themselves, speak about their own skills, speak about their talents in a way that's real, that is more authentic to what their skills are. Another series of questions, and again, this is in your packets, but you could another series of questions related to behavior is really sort of digging into what makes you stand out amongst your peers. What criteria are you using as you select your next employer? What industries are you considering? Company criteria, roles and titles, sort of like really getting to know who they are and what they're bringing, and sort of can help reveal a candidate's level of sort of introspection and experience. Another one is, does your potential hire get it? If you've sort of established here at GHC that you're really looking to hire people that are already sort of dedicated to diversity, equity, and inclusion, there are ways to embed questions about their sense of wokeness, for lack of a better word. But do they get it? Is this something that's a priority for them? Are these initiatives something that they're going to be really excited to be on board about? And so in pages 8 and 9 of your handout, there is a series of a lot of questions that you can ask very specifically to try to get to have people speak to their own sort of competencies as relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So to what extent has pursuing a racial or other types of equity and inclusion been a priority in your work, and how did you approach it? Why is it important to you? What were some of the core challenges for that? And so really sort of allowing someone to speak to those particular competencies on the front end will give you a lot of information about their role in being able to participate in these larger efforts that you're making as an organization. And I would recommend not having it just be like one very specific portion of the interview, like now we're going to ask you questions about equity, but really sort of have it be a sort of standard part of your follow-up questions. So they've answered a question specific, maybe related to a role or an experience that they had, and then you can ask a follow-up question of sort of how And was there any way that racial equity could have come in or played a role in that particular thing? Sort of really embedding it throughout the questions that you're asking in a number of different arenas, and you'll be a lot more likely to be able to sort of elucidate those factors and those competencies. On page 12 of your handout, there is a series of potential interview questions that you can dig into. That will set you up to be able to know a lot more about those particular competencies as well. In your handout, there's also sort of ways that you can specifically mitigate for bias when interviewing multicultural candidates. This is based on Oregon Health and Science University's research again. I'm not going to go into that a lot right now because I do want to give you some time to reflect on some of the things that we've talked about today. I've been talking for a long time, for me at least. And so I want to give you all the opportunity just to take some time to reflect on what your role in hiring processes has been. Thinking back, are there ways that you can remember that biases did or did not play a role? Or maybe you did a really good job of mitigating bias in that moment. Are there processes internally, policies, practices across the board organizationally that leave a lot of room for biases to play out? Are there any things that I've talked about today, any of the best practices or recommendations that you think could be useful to start to incorporate into your practices? Any of that. So I want you to take some time to reflect on the hiring processes here and how biases might be impacting your processes. So again, this is a partner work. If you want to do threes, that's fine, but probably not more than three. And take some time to just sort of talk through what your experiences has been with the hiring process here, and if you can think of any ways that biases might be playing out. And then also, based on the information today, what are some of the things that you feel like you could do or implement for the next hiring process that you're involved in? So take some time to talk about that. All right, so in the time that we have remaining, I would love to hear some of your reflections on that, if anyone's willing to share in the room. Some of the ways that you think that you maybe see bias having opportunity to show up in your processes, and or any ideas that you have for ways that you might be able to incorporate any of the things we've talked about into your practices. Yeah.
I've got an employee whose name is kind of difficult to pronounce, Shura, and a lot of people come and ask me or ask somebody else how do you pronounce his name, and there are other people who just say whatever is closest and sort of don't take the time to try, and I think that's something that I wish that more people would make an effort to say his name. That's just
Yeah.
Be aware of the fact that it's not easy.
Yeah, and so that's a manifestation of bias, right? Like that's what microaggression essentially is a manifestation, a behavioral manifestation of bias. And especially because there are some names that may be difficult to pronounce that we have a tendency to be fine with putting in the effort to figure it out. You know, like if you can say Dostoevsky, then you could probably figure out how to say someone's name and take the time to practice it. I know for a long time, actually, I don't know if Naomi had shared this in this room. I think she'd be fine with me saying this. But so Naomi's name is Naomi. And she very frequently introduces herself as Naomi because she's gotten very tired of trying to get people to say it the way that like the Japanese pronunciation of her name. And so I actually have been friends with Naomi for a long time, and didn't know that was the intended pronunciation of her name for a long time. And it wasn't until we had sort of established trust enough for her to trust me to put in the work. But like, she's like, we're friends. You know what? My name is actually Naomi. Actually, I think I asked her, I was like, because I think I had heard her husband saying her name correctly. And I was like, I feel like I'm saying it wrong. And so, but like once I asked, then she knew that she could trust me to figure it out. And so part of that is really taking the time to figure it out. because the ongoing impact of that erasure of like your name isn't even important enough to say right can be really significant. So yeah, that's an easy way to create inclusion in daily life. Yeah.
So would I actually take it a step further?
Mm-hmm.
I don't want that individual to feel really like they're the only person who has the issue, because it's really not the case. There are people who are a homogenous group who have difficulty with pronounced names. Mm-hmm. So when we do an introduction, to call on them as well and say, hey, what's the correct pronunciation? And you say it right. My last name is Markle, and people murder it all the time. So,
yeah. And here's the thing is that but when you actually have a privileged identity, even if that you might be having that experience of having your name mispronounced, then coming from a privileged identity, if someone says Tucky instead of Tucci, it doesn't actually hurt me in the same sort of way, because I'm experiencing privilege in the rest of my life as I'm moving through the world, and so that feels like potentially less like an erasure, right? But I think that what you're speaking to is really sort of establishing it as standard for practice, that we are going to offer that kind of honor to one another and respect to one another, to take the time to say each other's names right. Yeah. Yes, thank you.
One thing that's really true about the GHC is we are very, very cognizant of what our culture is, and very proud of that. And I was talking to Lorraine and saying, one of the things that really jumped out in your presentation to me, and I've said myself and others after an interview, oh, they're a really good fit. Mm-hmm. And it's like, okay, well, we're looking for someone that's walking, talking, just like maybe me, or several of us in the room. And so focusing more on, cultural diversity, or our mission and vision, and those kinds of questions in our interview questions would really be helpful, because that's really the culture that we're talking about, that we want, especially as we move forward with cultural awareness.
Yeah, you're speaking to the way that in-group happens, right? Who are the people that oh yeah, it just really vibed with them. They felt like they were pretty chill. They'd probably be a good fit on this team. What does that mean? And then again, that's part of if you can diversify your panel, then you have the amount of in-groups that can be represented in the process of seeing that. Then even if in-group bias is playing out, then you have multiple in-group biases that are being factored in that allow for all different kinds of people to be able to have opportunity there. Yeah. Any other ideas for processes that could potentially, ways that you might want to incorporate the mitigation of bias? Yeah.
I really love the sample questions about how to recruit for folks that will join in the work that you're trying to do in the organization. And so asking people, I think I've asked different questions about maybe what for people who are just coming out of school, what kind of extracurriculars, what kind of things have they put their effort to, their passions for things. But I think being more explicit about hey, where have you worked in your past to decrease inequities in the world and to work to improve inclusion? Has that been part of your studies or your work experience? Where have you pursued that? And being more explicit about those specific areas instead of just, and that will hopefully reinforce the culture that we're trying to be here. Even if it's not necessarily a diverse candidate, but it's somebody who understands the importance of inclusion and the importance of equity.
And it establishes that as your organizational value. This is what we're trying to do here. Are you interested in joining us in that? And again, I think that what you mentioned, that explicit part of that, is important. In our application processes, we also so we have it easy where we can have people be talk about our mission of eliminating racism and empowering women, and have people sort of interact with their desire to support that mission. But a lot of times, even in people's responses to that, we might get responses that are just I love everyone and I believe in justice, which is very nice. But what specifically have you more to what you're talking about? How have you worked for racial equity and say race, or say the specific kind of equity, like be explicit rather than just sort of like these sort of like broad strokes of like I care, but like how do you care? How have you shown up in ways that where you've been able to show that you care?
So, my question is, what if the interviewer has not really engaged in that work? Would you recommend that they engage in that work before they ask that question?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, your tools are only, any of these things are only as good as like the people that are using them. And so, yeah, if the interviewer doesn't know what to be looking for in an answer to that question, then yeah, it's probably not going to be helpful to answer that question. But that's why a lot of this work is going to be more in sort of establishing the internal culture of anybody that's part of these hiring processes has the opportunity to get support if it's not already a part of your sort of like generalized understanding, is to really sort of dig into providing training on, again, like we could do implicit bias trainings all the time. We did the racial justice workshop series once already. Have people go through the racial justice workshop series. I think we're going to be offering it again in the fall. So those are those kinds of opportunities, and really sort of, try to provide the opportunities for people to sort of know what the answer could or should be that you're looking for. Yeah. And I'm realizing that y'all need to do your reports, and I don't want to take up any more time. So thank you so much for having me. That's all I've got. And thanks for listening. And that's it. I don't know who's next.